Welcome back to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Romans Education Part 7, and this is going to cover the notes in sessions 25 and 26. All right, so let me just pull it all together for us and see if this won't make a lot of sense to us. Satan's plan, as revealed in Isaiah 14, is that he wants to be like the Most High. We understand the two issues that are involved in that, to be the possessor of heaven and earth. One part of that plan is for Satan to be the possessor of the earth, and when Adam fell in the garden, he succeeded in doing that. Since that time, his work has been to hold on to the possession of the earth, and he has been working diligently to do that. The means that he used prior to the flood did succeed in producing the world of the ungodly. But God judged that world with the flood and saved 8 people. And when they came off the ark, there was a day condition in the world. Satan knows how critical it is to not just bring a night status into the world, but to truly produce the world of the ungodly again. Because if he is going to hold on to the possession of the earth, that has to be produced. And so, once again, he begins to do that, and he is using as his primary tool after the flood, and you don't need to write this on your timeline, but his primary tool is to produce an untruth that will unseat and replace the truth. And he wants those, as we talked about earlier, he wants those untruths to be as desirable as they can be. Those untruths, we have been studying them as they are referred to as darkness. Therefore, the truth is talked about as light. Now, that's Satan's overall plan. Let's talk about how he changed the world after the flood, what he did to bring that about. From Genesis chapter 9 to Genesis chapter 17, the world was in a condition. When they stepped off the boat, you could say it was bright daylight. They knew God and they knew things about God. But as men began to multiply and as time began to progress, the untruths began to get a foothold and they began to spread. They started out very slow, but as they gained traction and they gained prominence, there came a time when those untruths outweighed the truth, and mainly that was the light of God consciousness. And then, as Paul writes in Romans 1, men no longer glorified God as God, but they made images like unto four-footed beasts and birds and creeping things, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator. Those untruths worked to reverse the day status and to bring in a night of darkness. Once that night of darkness was brought into being, then we realized that men had really succumbed to those two main issues of Satan's untruths, that they had no longer glorified God as God, and neither were thankful. Those don't sound like big deals, but the things that are contained in them, in that terminology, really does show that Satan's darkness had accelerated to the place where now the untruth was more commonly accepted and realized than the truth. And that's what ruled in the hearts and in the minds of men. Now that Satan has a night into place, let's discuss the nighttime strategy that he has. It is that night that allowed him to really begin to function as the power of darkness. And he begins to do that, especially for the Gentiles. And so when that night comes into being, so does his covering come into being. He wants to increase the blackness of that night. And when when Israel goes away captive to Babylon, then he brings his veil into place, and now you have a double covering over the Gentiles of the world. And Satan now sets up a base of operations, and all of this is with a goal out here in mind. Because he is working towards something at the very climax of his night. and he is working to get there. But in order to get there, he's got to get some things. Let me explain what these things are to do. The covering was intended to do three things. Number one, the covering was meant to keep people in darkness. Darkness was already there. It was meant to keep them there. Number two, that covering was meant to obstruct the light of the truth, so that that light could not be seen by those who were under that covering. And the third thing it did is it intensified the darkness of Satan's night. That covering was in case his policy against Israel failed and they did become the light of the world. He sought to increase the darkness of his night by continuing to replace truth with untruth. And then he developed some deeds. I'm going to put them in over here. I think they're already on your timeline. These works of darkness. And I'm putting them in over here for a reason, but those works of darkness. And by the way, I just want to say it this way. What Satan did to bring about the world of ungodly as his primary means before the flood is not the same thing that he used after the flood. After the flood, he is using his untruths to do that. I'm not saying there weren't untruths back here. There were. That wasn't his primary means. This now, in conjunction with the changes that got made at the flood, became his primary means. And in order to make sure that the darkness of his night increased, Satan devised some things called works of darkness. And those works are meant to feed and increase the darkness of his night. Those are the very works, I'm putting them over here because those are the works that we are called to cast off and put on the armor of light. Once Israel was carried away captive, Satan was able to do several things. He was able to come into the land of Israel. By the way, that whole thing about casting out devils when the Lord is here in his public ministry has to do with him clearing out that land once again in order to shine some light on an issue. But he is able to come into that land. He is able to set up his base of operations in the land of Israel. The nation, as I mentioned in the last session, became his lawful captive, and then he brings his secondary covering into effect, and that is that thick veil that increases the darkness of his night. Now I want to talk about the veil that was cast over all nations. There's four things that the veil was intended to do. The first thing is to thicken and intensify the darkness of Satan's night. It was to entrench those untruths. Secondly, it was to increase Satan's ability to keep men from seeing the light of the truth. The third thing it was designed to do is to increase his ability to not only just overcome them with darkness, but to keep them in darkness. And the last thing is it darkened his night again. It intensified the darkness of his night toward a particular goal. And that was a very important step in Satan being able to achieve what he meant to achieve. Both that covering and that veil, as we saw, are going to be destroyed back at the start of the kingdom. But for now, both of those are still in place. During the first three installments of the fifth course of punishment, he is cementing that veil in place so that when Jesus shows up, the Gentiles are totally in darkness, and the nation of Israel is almost totally in darkness, and Jesus is going to come along and function as the light of the world. And now I want to talk about when Jesus shows up, the nation enters the climactic stage, and now I want to talk to you about Satan's strategy in the climactic stage. And this is the point where now we're going to begin to introduce some things that we have not talked about up to this point. Number one, as Israel entered her climactic stage, and this is important to understand, Satan's program in the world also entered its climactic stage. They happened at the exact time, and that is not a coincidence. Satan is actually pushing things toward a specific end, and he wants to get that done. And so his climactic stage coincides with Israel's climactic stage. And during that climactic stage in Israel's program, in his program, what Satan wants to do is he wants to deal with Jesus as being the light of the world. He starts by doing that by tempting him in the wilderness. When he does not succumb to any of those things, Satan thinks that he will extinguish the light by having Jesus put to death. The second thing he's going to do is take that veil and put it into effect into the nation of Israel so they do not so readily respond to that light. And those are two of the things that he is going to get done. And that is why at that time, by the time you get here, and actually it's being done back here, but by the time you get over here, what you have is, let me be more specific. By the time you get right here at the cross, the world and Israel have joined hands together and confederated together against God and against His Son. And I'm going to show you some things in the book of Acts and that we will pull out of Psalm 2. But they took counsel together against God and against His anointed. And that took place at that point at the cross. This was not just something that Satan decided to do because he was just evil. This is part of a carefully orchestrated plan. And that means that the things that Satan, all right, let me just say it to you this way because we're going to have to get to it anyway. By the time John the Baptist shows up and the climactic stage of Israel's program begins, the world at large, those Gentiles, do not know the true and living God, and there is no light in them. And the nation of Israel, when Jesus shows up, has so corrupted itself. During these three, you remember how this third one is the 400 years where Israel doesn't hear a peep from God. And during that famine of hearing the word of the Lord, what happens? The Pharisees and the Sadducees come into being. They codify the Babylonian Talmud. They've corrupted the doctrine. And when Jesus comes on the scene, He's going to give that corrective doctrine so that He can get His disciples believing the light of the truth again. And that darkness that is in the land of Israel now is allowing Satan to do some things that up to this point he has not been allowed to do. And in his mind, everything is going his way. Now look, I'm going to break it down for you this way. Before I talk to you about it as a single unit, now I want to show it to you broken down. Here's what is happening. When you get to the place where John the Baptist is, and the world is as dark as it is, and the nation of Israel is as dark as it is, here's what they have done. They have said to God the Father, we don't want you. That is basically what has been said by both of them. And when I said to you that Israel has looked at God as though He's not that much different from the other gods of the world, that got done all the way back here, and a fellow named Sennacherib picked that up, because when he came against the northern kingdom of Israel, do you remember what he said? He said, everybody has a God that thinks they're going to deliver them out of my hand. He said, and it hasn't happened once up to this point, and it's not going to happen with you either. And the reason is because he doesn't think there's any difference between Israel's God and those other gods. Because of Israel refusing to be salt and light, his name is now blasphemed among the Gentiles. And so the nation, if that's the way the nation feels, if they're not going to be salt and light and show forth the light of God conscious, then what are the other Gentile nations supposed to think? They're going to be thinking just like they did. And there they rejected the Father. And when they get to the cross, now guess what? They not rejected the Father, but they've rejected the Son. And then when you get past the cross, you have the extension of mercy. And in Acts chapter 2, you have the Spirit coming and administrating those apostles and their message and the three opportunities for the nation to repent and change their mind about Jesus being the Christ. And they respond with increased hostility, and they murder Stephen at the end of that. And at the end of that, here's what the world and the nation has said. We don't want the Father, we don't want the Son, and we don't want the Spirit. And when Satan achieved the rejection of all three members of the Godhead, he earned the right to do this thing that's sitting right over here that I'm going to identify for you shortly. And he accomplished every requirement in order to get that done. And that was the very thing that God had been working to keep him from doing. But because he did that, and now I'm going to talk to you about this term that I've been using, because I've told you all along that the night is far spent, the day of the hand. It's not about the dispensation of grace itself. It's about the timing of when God brought in the dispensation of grace. And when the final rejection of the third member of the Godhead takes place, and the Father is rejected, and the Son is rejected, and the Spirit is rejected, and Satan now says, and now, and by the way, does Satan know about the dispensation of grace? No, he did not. As he goes, now I can do that thing that I've been working toward since the time I started using my untruths to start turning the day into a night. I'm going to begin to do this. But before he can do that, God interrupts the program. And he brings in the dispensation of grace. This is why he does it here. Because Satan is now, he has earned the legal right to do this thing. And when he gets ready to do that, you have to understand that God the Father has also earned the right to bring in a dispensation of grace and interrupt that program with Israel. So before Satan can bring now what he has earned the legal right to do to pass, God says, time out. And now we're going to bring in a dispensation of grace. But look, when this is over, I'm going to tell you that final thing that Satan had wanted to do, he has already earned the right to do, and it is going to happen. The only thing to do now is for sons and daughters to begin to cast off those works of darkness which are fueling Satan's night, that when this thing gets ready to happen, he needs it to be at a fever pitch. And if you impact that, if you're slowing that train down on him, that is the thing that he cannot allow to happen. That's what's going. You know what we're doing? We're getting in his way on purpose. And now the reason he's responding to you isn't because you're a Christian. Are you kidding? He's got plenty of Christians that are contributing to the darkness of his night. They're preaching untruths every Sunday. The reason he's responding to you is because now you are getting in the way of being able to utilize this event that he has now earned the right to do. But now he doesn't have the momentum going into that to make it happen the way he needs that to happen. And what's on the line there? The continued possession of the earth. So your Father is going to say something to you. By the way, and I'll give you this little hint too. When he says, the night is far spent, the day is at hand, let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, put on the armor of light, and let us walk honestly as in the day. You're not going to be in the day of wrath. He didn't say you were. But there's something you're supposed to walk after that is in accordance with something your Father is going to do in his day that impacts what Satan is trying to build up for. Remember I talked to you about him keeping that fire burning hot, or keeping that pot at a rolling boil, and when you hinder that process, he's just responding to what you're doing. Now, because of, and all three of those members of the God, here's where Satan was after in that. Because here was the boast all along. The only reason that you are God is because you are omnipotent and you can make it all happen. And if anybody ever wonders, and they do all the time, well, if God knew Satan was going to rebel, why didn't he just throw him in the lake of fire then? Or when he did rebel, why didn't he go ahead and throw him in the lake of fire then? God certainly has the power to do that. But because God is not going to be the possessor of heaven and earth because he happens to be the one with the most power, he is going to prove to all creation who the rightful possessor of heaven and earth is. And he will do that by allowing the adversary to prove himself right or wrong. And the boast of the adversary is, people would rather live in my world than yours. And that happened in the world of the Gentiles and in the nation with the Father. It happened here during the ministry of the Son. Yes, a few believed on him, but the nation at large did not. And it happened again in the extension of mercy with the Spirit, and now Satan has gotten everything to the place where it looks like it's all going his way. And even though the cross is a setback and the resurrection, listen carefully, he doesn't view that as a fatal blow. He did not view, you know what, okay, that didn't go the way I wanted it to go. It turned out, you know what, he did the redemption thing. And yes, he rose from the dead. But that doesn't keep Satan from doing this. And he knew what he had to do that. They crucified their Messiah. Yeah, that turned out to be something he didn't think it was going to be, the Redeemer function. But in the extension of mercy, if he can get that final rejection of the third member of the Godhead, he'll have earned the right to do this thing. And when he does, now he has his best chance to hold on to the possession of the earth. And so, with all of that, and we're going to come back to this issue about them joining hands because I'm going to show you that over in the book of Acts. So now let's talk about Satan's strategy over in the extension of mercy. Because at the very moment when the extension of mercy ended, at the very moment that Satan had finally brought everything to the place where he could now do this thing that God had been keeping him from doing, that's when God stops the program with Israel. And because he stopped the program with Israel, he postponed this event that was going to be happening in their program. And during this dispensation of grace, all of that is on hold. And now Satan is under the pressure to keep everything up so that when it ends, he can accomplish what he was meant to do. Now, the fulfillment of what Satan wanted to do in his night could not be done. Now, I'm going to take you to a couple of places in the Scripture that we're going to begin to look at this stuff, and that is when Jesus comes, he is not just the fulfiller of the Davidic covenant, but when he comes, he is not just manifesting himself to Israel, but when he comes, he is also presenting himself truly as to who he is. He is God in the flesh. Now, in view of that, I want to take you to John chapter 1 and verse 1. I sure hope that's the next. There might be a couple of slides. There you go. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And now we see that Jesus as the expressive member of the Godhead. And by that I mean he's the one that does the action, he does the creating, and he's the one that does the speaking. Hence he is known as the Word. He is the expressive member of the Godhead. And now let's continue to read now again. In him was life, and the life was the, watch this carefully, the small case L, light of men. That is the light of God consciousness. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. In other words, he is God in the flesh. And if they're going to recognize him for who he is, they're going to have to recognize that fact. Remember what he asked Peter? Who do men say that I am? Oh, say Jeremiah, John, one of the prophets. He said, who do you say I am? Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's the whole issue that was there. And so when he's functioning as that, now look at this next verse 5. And the light, there's the small case L, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. And the reason is because of the effect of that veil, that second covering, that now light could shine in darkness. And you know what? Those folks that are in darkness, they don't see a light. That's how cemented in that thing is with them. And as I said to you before, that verse does not say, and the light poorly shined in the darkness. It did its job. The problem is the darkness is now so thick and so dense that the light cannot be observed by those that are in the darkness. Okay, and now I want to take you to Ephesians chapter 4. And I want you to look. Now, this is an issue, and I know it's in an advanced epistle, but it's the issue of just how successful Satan's night had become, and the methodology that he's employing here. This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord, that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind. By the way, that's when they became vain in their imaginations. That's that same issue. Vanity of their mind, having the understanding darkened. Do you see that? Their understanding, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of their heart, who being past feeling have given themselves over to lasciviousness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. And the thing that I want to point out to you here is when someone is faced with the light and they reject that light, and they are faced again with the light of the truth and they reject the light of the truth, and they're faced again, eventually they will become past feeling. They are going to get themselves in a position where you could say, well, if they repented, would God receive them? Of course He would. But here's the kick. They won't. Because now they are past feeling. They are not. They are now going to work all uncleanness with greediness. And when he's talking about greediness, he's not talking about in the way that we normally think about it as somebody that's stingy or miserly or something like that. They're talking about someone now who, and by the way, you can look that up in the dictionary and you can see that that word has a secondary meaning, that they find great pleasure and have an intense desire to work those works of uncleanness. By the way, they work all uncleanness. That has to do with some deeds that are being performed, and those deeds are fueling the darkness of Satan's night. And so they have this craving for these works or these deeds of uncleanness. Now, how thick is the darkness when Jesus shows up? And this, I'm going to take you to John chapter 3. He that believeth on Him is not condemned, but he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that small case L, light, is come into the world. By the way, there is a large case L. And when you talk about the capital L-I-G-H-T, what are you talking about? Now you're talking about the Son of God. So when you're talking about Jesus, you're going to see a capital L. But when you're talking about the light of the truth that He is shining, it's a small case L. And that's important, because when you read through John 1, you'll find those going back and forth through the deal. If you just read them all the same, you miss the point of that. So, and we'll get a chance to look at a little bit of that in a minute. But he's saying, this is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, and here's the condition of the world. Men love darkness rather than light. And then he tells them why. And this is very instructive. Because their deeds were evil. And because of that, men said, no, we love darkness, and we don't want the light. Now, I think it goes without saying that there's some deeds that God considers to be evil. They were going to pursue those greedily. Now let me take you to John. I think it's John. Oh, I'm sorry, we didn't finish it. For everyone that doeth evil hateth the light, neither cometh to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. But he that doeth truth cometh to the light, that his deeds may be made manifest, that they are wrought in God. And I think everybody can see that. Now, let's look at this next one, John 8:44. Look what he says about these guys. He's talking to the Pharisees, but look, ye are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father ye will do. I know we've been to this verse twice before, but I want to point out this first part, because here's what the religious leaders of Israel were doing when the Lord showed up. They were doing the bidding of Satan. The lust of your father ye will do. They were following the very agenda that Satan was laying out for them. And now back to John chapter 3, and I think that's the next one. And this is the condemnation, that light has come to the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. When John comes on the scene, give me that next verse, Trent, and we'll take it back over there. Take a look at this. No, give me the next one, because I think we've seen it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light. By the way, can you see the lights now? See, there was a man sent from God, his name was John. He was not that capital L light, but was sent to bear witness of that capital L light. So he's not bearing witness to the light of God. He's bearing witness to the right. And that was the true capital L light, which small case lighteth every man that cometh into the world. You see how those are used there? Okay. And he was in the world. Now this is important. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came into his own received him not. And I put that in parenthesis, as a whole, because there were some that received him. So look at the next phrase. But as many as received him, you see, there were some that did receive him. So when he says he came to his own received him not, he's not talking about every single one of them. There was some. And as many as received him, he gave the power to become sons of God. But do you understand what you just read right there? You just read what Psalm 2 was talking about when it said that the world and Israel both had made that rejection here. Look at the first one. It says, he was in the world. If you're talking about the world, who are you talking about? Gentiles. He was in the world, and the world was made by him. Yes? Didn't we see that? He created all things. All right? And the world what? You know what? You can go back and look at those world history. Someone said, well, you know what? You Christians, you talk about that. What about the Chinese and their great dynasties that lasted for centuries? They knew him not. They didn't even have the light of God consciousness. You know what they were? Darkness. Revel in their history. It is Satan's handiwork. Oh, we want to study the great empires of the world. You want to study the work of the adversary. Now, I'm not saying it's a sin to study history. I'm saying men look at history and lift it up like it's some great thing. It is nothing but a testimony to the fact that the world was made by him, and he came into the world, and they didn't even know who he was. Not only that, it wasn't just the world, but then he says, and he came into his own, and his own received him not. You know what that is? That's rejection by the world and by the nation. That's the very thing that we've been talking about here. The true light showed up. Now let me show you something about John the Baptist, because that's when the climactic stage starts, right? There is another that beareth witness of me, and I know that the witness which he witnesseth of me is true. Ye sent unto John, and he bare witness unto the truth. But I received not testimony from man, but these things I say that you might be saved. He, talking about John, was a burning and shining light. Now let's stop there for a moment. When John comes on the scene, there is something a little bit different about John's light. It's described this way. He was a burning and shining light, which means that even though there was a covering and a veil that was now cast over the people, and that veil is even now applied to the nation of Israel, what we're seeing is John's light was of such a nature that even those Pharisees came down to see him. And look at this next part. And ye were willing for a season to rejoice in his light. John had something about his ministry that had this sit up and take notice aspect to it, that even though the veil was in place and the darkness was thick, there was something about John's ministry that even the religious leaders came down and went, we like this. Yeah, they could feel the heat even if they couldn't see the light. Okay, so they were willing to rejoice. And you know when the corner turned and they suddenly decided, no, we don't want John. No, John is not good. Forget what I said. John is not good. We don't rejoice. That's not light. When John said their deeds were evil. Nobody likes being called a generation of vipers. You know what he was doing? He was saying, you guys think you're light, but you're not. And because they love darkness rather than light, that rejoicing with John's light was only for a season. And now they have a choice to make. We're either going to do something about our deeds, or we're going to reject the light. And we all know what they did. They rejected the light. Now, I got to take you back to, and John 3:19 is the next one. And that's why I'm seeing John's the one writing about this, right? And there he is. And he says they love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. That's what they couldn't tolerate. All right, now let me take you over to the next one. What is that next? Psalm 2. Thank you. That's what I meant. Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The heathen and the people, that's two groups. The kings of the earth, by the way, kings plural of the earth. You're talking about Gentile kings, aren't you? Yes, you are. We covered this once. Kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers, that's Israel's, take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. You know what that happened right there. Against the Lord and against his anointed. Now, if you don't think that's really what that is, then let me take you to by the way, the rest of Psalm 2 says this. Now look, this is, he that sitteth in heaven shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. He shall speak unto them in his wrath and vex them in his sore displeasure. Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. He says, you know what? You can reject me and you can reject my son, but I am going to speak to you in my wrath and then vex you in my sore displeasure. That's talking about the day of wrath out there. Now that's the rest of Psalm 2. But let me take you over to this next passage in Acts chapter 4. Remember, you're in the extension of mercy. And what I'm telling you is that Psalm 2 was a truth of by the time Jesus goes on that cross, that thing is done. So look what they say. This is right in the middle of the extension of mercy. And being let go, they went to their own company and reported all that the chief priest and elders had said unto them. And when they heard that, the rest of the believing remnant heard, they lifted up their voice to God with one accord and said, Lord, thou art God which has made heaven and earth and the sea and all that in them is, who by the mouth of thy servant David hath said, why did the heathen rage and the people imagine vain things? The kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. They're saying that no, don't give me that one yet. Back me up there. They're saying that in the middle of the extension of mercy by saying, this has already taken place. Now they're quoting Psalm 2, but you notice what they didn't quote? They didn't quote, the Lord shall laugh from heaven. He'll vex them with his wrath and in his sore display. They didn't quote that part. Why? Because that part hadn't taken place yet. The only part they quoted was the part that had taken place. But look what they're going to quit quoting, and now they're going to talk about it. So now give me that next one. For of a truth, against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed. Why are they saying that? Yeah, because remember the terminology that was used back there? Psalm 2, against the Lord and his anointed. Remember, and he's the Christ. It says, of a truth against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed. Both Herod and Pontius Pilate with the Gentiles. Wait a minute. Herod and Pontius Pilate, aren't they rulers among the Gentiles? Didn't he say, the kings of the earth with the Gentiles have set themselves together? And the people of Israel were gathered together Do you see that? See, when I told you that, that was just my interpretation of Psalm 2. That was actually the interpretation of Peter. He said that's what was happening. For to do whatsoever thy hand and counsel determined for to be done. He said, you've already said what they were going to do. You've already talked about that. And now, in Acts chapter 4, in the middle century, they've done that. And Satan only has one last hurdle to do, and that's reject this ministry now of the apostles in the extension of mercy. That's the last hurdle he's waiting for. Because by their own admission, the Father has been rejected and his Christ has been rejected. Because here's what Satan is after. Because when he can get this Spirit, this third member of the Godhead, the Spirit rejected too, he will have now earned the right to bring his Christ into the world. That's why it says, against the Lord and his Christ. I want to back you up and show you something that was back in Psalm 2. Back me up to the end of Psalm 2, please, Trent. One more, right there. No, there you go. Yet have I set, look, he says, you know what? I'm going to vex you in my sore displeasure. Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. You know why? Because there's another one that's going to be set on that holy hill, and it's not God's. That's why these personal pronouns are there, against his Christ. This is my king. Because there's another Christ that's going to come on the scene, and Satan has now, by the rejection of all three members of the Godhead, earned the right to bring his Antichrist on the scene. He is not the power of darkness. He is the prince of darkness. And Satan has been waiting to do that because there's something he wants to do out there with his man in place that will allow him to hold on to the possession of the earth. He's already earned the right to bring him on the scene. So you know what? When this thing is over, the dispensation of grace, that is going to happen. There's nothing, God is not going to stop that because those are the rules of engagement. And he's going to play by the rules. And so Satan has produced a condition in the world which now allows him to see if it's true that the world would rather live under him than under the Lord. And when he brings that man of sin, he's got a lot of different names or titles, and it depends on what he's doing as to which of those titles is being talked about. But when he brings the man of sin into place and begins to orchestrate what he's doing in the world, the Lord is then going to respond to the blackest part of Satan's night with his day. And he is going to end that day when he shall destroy them with the brightness of his coming. All of that terminology has worked right into everything that we have been talking about. Satan has been working all along toward that. And let me just look at something in my Bible real quick, because I actually told the folks in Monaghan's wrong, so they'll be searching all week in the wrong spot. And I am sorry for that. I had something else in my head when I was thinking about that, and I don't want to get you wrong. And Mark wrote down here with me, and y'all, after you're over, be sure and say hello to him. Billy didn't come because she's sick, and so he volunteered to come with me and have someone else to sleep in the other chair while I'm driving, and. This is, maybe I did tell them right. Let me just look. Hold on. Yeah, I did tell you right. Ezekiel 28. Now, don't turn there yet. Wait. Satan has been so working toward this thing with his Christ out here. that you will find in Ezekiel 28 a dry run before he ever earned the right to do it, where he talks about a man who presents himself as God. He doesn't have the right to fully implement everything because these things haven't taken place yet. And now you see so much more, just even today, so much more than, because if all you think about is, well, God was having this program with Israel, and then he interrupted that program, and he brought in this dispensation of grace and the body of Christ, and when it's over, he'll resume his program with Israel. All of that's right, but you understand that is only the very basic foundational knowledge to this. What you're supposed to understand is what was going on during that time. Satan, by his works of darkness, putting a status of night into this. And when God interrupts this program, that night is far spent. And that far spent includes the fact that Satan has now done everything that he had to do in order to legally bring in his Christ and now produce a world that would rather live under him than under the Lord and reject the Lord totally. And you understand that there's timing to that. That God just didn't go, well, let's have some dispensation of grace. He is waiting until the conditions were exactly what they were, and before Satan can bring that in, he's saying, I now have the right to do this, so before you do yours, I'm going to do mine, and then I'm going to look at my sons and daughters and say, how would you like, in view of what Satan is trying to do here, how would you like to cast off some works of darkness? That's the thing. And when you understand what Satan is doing here and the godly hatred and abhorrence for that is generated in you, your natural response to reading that phrase, and look, I'm not going to do it next time, I'm going to do it now. But that natural response to reading that phrase is to say, if the night is far spent, I understand what's entailed in that and I have to do something. I can't just leave that alone. Now, what I planned to do today was I was bringing these fortune cookies. I was going to bring fortune cookies, I was going to pass them out. And I was going to ask you, when's the last time has everybody here ever had a fortune cookie at a Chinese restaurant? John, you ever had one?
We just did today.
Did you? Yeah. Did you read your fortune?
Yeah.
Do you remember what it was?
Yeah, it says anything worth doing.
Okay, I don't want to know. All right, so did you get one before today?
Yeah.
Do you remember what it was? No. And why? Do you ever get one, Nadine? Do you remember what it said? No. Okay, and so why don't we remember those? Because they don't mean anything. Trent, take me back to that slide that I didn't want you to show in that previous PowerPoint, and I want you to put it up on the PowerPoint, and I want you to read this because, listen, I'm trying to make this point. When you read Romans 13:12, you can't read that like a fortune cookie. Oh, isn't that nice? Let's move on. I don't know what, but now that you know what is packed in to that phrase, the night is far spent, that what we've been covering all these weeks, that you now understand all these components. When we walk this thing through about what Satan did before the flood, and then he started when they came off the ark, and he brought it into a night condition, and he increased that darkness. He brought in his covering and his veil and the condition of the nation when John the Baptist started the climactic scene, and then what happened with the Son and what happened with the Spirit and what he qualified himself to do and purchased the right to do. And God, before he could do that, intervened with the dispensation of grace and equips us to cast off those works of darkness. When you understand all of that, then you know what? And by the way, this note that you're about to see is a real note. I just changed one word in it. That's all I did. And here it is. You ever seen those little things that get cut out of the paper and they paste a letter up and they don't want anybody to know who sent it? Read that. What does that say? If you went out tonight and you found that note on the windshield of your car, what would be going through your mind? What would go through your mind, Ron? You found that on the windshield of your car.
Somebody doesn't like me coming
Okay. And what else? What?
Call the police.
Call the police.
They say you're crazy.
Well, this is a real note. I mean, I just copied it.
I know.
It's a note. But I mean, would that cause you, let me ask you this. Do you think you'd forget about it by the time you got home? Hey, you know what? It's Bob and Boo's house. What did we, no. Form a perimeter. Look, you know what? Do you think you could remember what that said by the time you got home? Do you think it'd be in your mind tomorrow? Do you think the next time Bible study rolled around, that might be in your mind? Now you know how you're supposed. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying now you know how you're supposed to feel when you read "The night is far spent." This isn't fortune cookie verses. That is describing the despicable situation and condition of this world that Satan has brought about. You were born into that. When you came into this world, this thing was pitch black. And untruth for a long time had outweighed the truth. So much so that when you finally learn the truth about something and you go to your friends thinking surely they'll embrace this, it'll be great, and you shine the light of the truth directly into their face, that darkness will comprehend it not. And they will work to extinguish that light. And to you say, I don't see, it makes perfect sense to me. And they don't see it. And when you understand this is all a result of what Satan is doing, but it's not over. Because what he wants to do, because the heavenly places, he only finds out after the fact that that's lost to him. It's not until Paul comes along and talks about the issue. I can imagine the first time Satan heard that we're getting glorified bodies and we're going to be up there. If you're Satan, if you're standing near, you could hear him say, what? Because this is a mystery to him. You remember his other boast, I am so wise, there's no secret that can be hid from me. And God had a secret that was hid from the foundation of the world. Satan doesn't view this as the final blow because that didn't stop this from taking place or from being able to take place. And so now we have an ability to impact something that goes beyond the dispensation of grace. And when you read "The night is far spent," and I know you haven't gotten everything about that, like walk honestly as in the day. There's things that we're going to do about that. We'll cover all of that. But what I'm trying to get you to see is when you read that ought to make something rise up in you. There ought to be, and I'm not just saying let's just get emotional over the Scripture, but it ought to elicit an emotional response toward what Satan has done in this world and what he is attempting to do. And it ought to make you say, just as a result of understanding everything packed into "the night is far spent," make you say the same thing you'd say about this. We got to do something. And you look at that verse and you say, we got to do something. But it's not just anything. Here's what your Father says. Yeah, and you know what you're going to do? Cast off those works of darkness and put on that armor of light. Now, I know we haven't discussed those in detail, and we are going to do that. But you got to understand that action stems out of the thinking. And in order to get you thinking about that, I have to take you through everything that's packed in that phrase. I know there are people that wonder, why is he spending 3 months on one part of a verse? Because if you read Romans 13:12 and you act like you just read your fortune cookie, I know it hasn't done its work in you yet. And we don't get to move on until it works. Otherwise, you know what you'll say? We tried that sonship stuff. That wasn't what it was cracked up to be. Oh, it's every bit of what it's cracked up to be. But you know what? We got to start looking at this like our Heavenly Father looks at it. If he looked at it enough to say, as soon as that extension of mercy is over and Stephen looks up and sees the Son standing at the right hand of the Father, and you understand what's about to happen next, and you realize that Satan has now brought the condition of this world to the place where he is about to be able to do what he's been practicing to do all the way since before, that ought to make you say, with your heavenly Father, stop. I want an opportunity to do something about this. We better just decide whose side we're on here. And this is not just about, let's go do a bunch of good stuff. This is about doing something to impact Satan's works of darkness. And that is not going to be done accidentally. Yes, I'm telling you, people can spend their whole life having a huge TV ministry and never impact his works of darkness one single second. Because in order to do that, you've got to understand the things that we've talked about over the last months. That's all got to be in your thinking. Remember, I told you it's like that phrase, when you walk into the ball game and you're going, what's going on? And they go, bottom of the ninth, 2 out. It's all they needed to say, and you get it. Well, now here's what your Father is saying. You look at Romans 13:12, and he's already set you up and said, you know what? The day of our salvation is nearer than when we believe. You got a diminishing opportunity to do something. So here's the first words out of my mouth in view of that. The night is far spent. And we just look at that and smile and go, okay, what's next? And that ought to be something that grips us. Now, I'm not saying that to try to coach you. I'm saying that to say that's the test of how we know this word is working in us. And if that's not working, then one of three things is happening. Either I'm not doing a very good job of leading you through it. That may well be. Number two, we haven't seen everything that we need to see to fully generate that in us. Or number three, you're fooling around. I'm going to tell you a little story, and this will be the last thing I'll tell you. I know it's a couple minutes after time, and I promise I'll make it short. When I went to college, I was in a pre-law study in Louisiana, and then I thought, God wanted me to be in the ministry. You understand how all that thinking is. And I went up there to Lynchburg, and I was going to go to college up there. Jerry Falwell had started Lynchburg Baptist College up there. Now it's Liberty, okay? And, I remember going up there and studying for the ministry. And I went up with 2 other guys from Louisiana. And up in Virginia, if you're from Louisiana, they think you're a Cajun. They think when you get to the Louisiana state line, it's all by you. You get in a P row and you go anywhere in the state you want to go. So we go up there. We were the Cajuns, and you know what? Here you are. You're away from home, and you're out in another state, and there's this beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains. And so you know what we did? We ran up and down the countryside. We did enough studying to pass. But you know what? We got out there, and we just had a big old time. We didn't get in trouble. We didn't vandalize. We didn't break curfew. We didn't do those things. But you know what? Look, class is out. Off we go. And so everybody kind of knew that. They just kind of knew that. So we're out there one day, and across the James River, there's a mountain on this side, and there's a mountain on the side, and there's a railroad trestle that runs across that. And I don't know, it's pretty high up. And I remember that down at the bottom of that river, there was a train track that ran parallel to the river as well, and they used to haul coal in that. And we would go down there, and we would get rocks, and we would throw them out, and by the time those rocks would hit that coal, they'd accelerated, and when they'd hit that coal, it just looked like an explosion happening in that coal car, because they were all open on the top. We thought that was the neatest thing, but the problem is you had to be accurate. Now, this was a sheer down cliff that got cut down. The trestle went across about 1/4 mile, and then it came to another cliff face and went onto the mountainside and on that way. It went behind us about, 75 yards and made a sharp left and disappeared into a tunnel. We had been there, and a train had come across the other side and had come through and disappeared. And then I got the bright idea, you know what, instead of trying to just throw that, I'm going to get a double handful of rocks, and I'm going to walk out on the trestle, and I'm going to drop them straight down. And the short story of it is that while I was down there, I thought I heard something behind me. And I thought, don't turn around, because then they'll laugh at you, because that's not cool. You're scared. So I acted like I was going to say something. And I turned around to say something, and the train had rounded the corner and seen me, and he hit that horn. And now I'm out on this trestle, and there's spaces about this big between the railroad ties. And then you have a railroad tie and a space about this big. And it's just a trestle. The train is wider than the trestle. I'm not going to beat it a quarter of a mile across, because the thing is doing probably 55, 60 miles an hour. They were flying across there. Trains in Monahans go faster than that. I've been doing 70 on the interstate, and I've watched them just track right along with me. But I know they were going fast. And so I thought, I got to get back to the land before the train gets there. Obviously, I made it. It was a very, very close call. I actually jumped the last part of that diagonally to get off the track. And before I hit the ground, that train passed me. And my buddies were standing at an angle, because the thing kind of went sideways, and the track came off at an angle, and they couldn't see between the cars enough to see if I was like this on the front of the train, or did I make it, and they were speechless, which was a feat. I'm sitting there on the other side, and I had this double handful of rock still in my hands as dust. And I thought to myself, I dropped those rocks, and I said to myself, what are you doing? Now, I'm not kidding. This isn't for effect. This was February the 13th, my father's birthday. And I thought to myself, what in the world are you doing? Did you come here to get killed by a train on a trestle, or did you come here to prepare for ministry? So I had this little talk with myself, and I thought, buddy, you better buckle up. And this is all happening really quickly. When the train passes, they're on the other side, and they're going, oh, man, I can't believe it. They're talking like that. And so we get in the car, and I go, look, we came here to prepare for ministry. We better, yeah. You know what I could tell? They did not have the perspective that I had. And I tried to tell them, look, we gotta stop. Yeah. But the next day after class, it was like, where are we going today? And I said, I'm going to the library. And they said, why? I said, I have got to focus on why I came here. Oh, man, they tried to talk me out of it. I'm not being mean about it. If they listen to this tape, I'm going to say they weren't being mean about it, but they wanted me to keep doing what I was doing. And I said no. So I went to the library. I took my books, and I was sitting at a table, and I was studying, and the dean of the college, Craig Lamp, walked through. And he walked by my table, and I saw him look. How you can kind of see out of the corner of your eye? He looked at me, and he went, and then he stopped, and he looked back, and he said this, what are you doing in here? Now, when the dean of the college asks you what you're doing in the library, you realize you have a reputation, right? And I said, it's a long story. I didn't tell him. I said, it's a long story, but you know what? I got to get with the program here. I didn't come here to fool around, and that's all I've been doing, so here I am. He said, where's your buddies? I said, I have no idea. They didn't avoid a train. Yeah. And he said, do they know where you are? I said, yes, sir. He said, are they upset with you? I said, yes, sir. He said, you really mean business? I said, I do. He said, get your books and come with me. And Craig Lamp took me to his office and sat down with me and said, if you're really serious about this, I'm going to show you behind the scenes how a ministry works. And several times a week, I'd sit in Craig Lamp's office, and he would sit and talk with me about things that were going on at the school and at the church and those kinds of things. And in fact, I got so comfortable with that, I can remember other people seeing me in there and thinking they were going to come in there, and Dr. Lamp would go, out. And I just kind of give them that. Look, because I'm special. And, here's, I was telling you that story for a reason. Yeah, it does. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We're gonna have to make a decision about,
Point being, what are we going to do with it?
is this?
It's not something you just listen to. Yeah, that's great.
That's right.
Okay, let's move on.
We gotta mean business. This is the time that you're gonna have to buckle up. Well, you're gonna have to decide. I'm not trying to scare you with that. I'm just trying to tell you, this is your Father's business that we're going to be engaged in here. Casting off the works of darkness is not some bravado statement that we make to make ourselves feel good. This is the real deal. And I'm going to tell you something. Right now is the time that I say right now, when we're through this doctrine, that is the time when you're going to find out what it means to be more than a conqueror, because you're going to have to endure the retaliatory attack of the adversary. And that, my friends, is preparing us for something we're going to do in the heavenly places. This is not for nothing. There is someone's cause at stake in us. So I'm just trying to say, when David asked, his brothers are hiding from the giants, and he goes, is there not a cause? Well, that's what I'm saying. I think our Father's cause is worth whatever we're going to go through here, because you know what? At the end of it, there is a glory associated with being a part of what our Father has been doing here, that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared. Okay, let's have prayer, and we'll be done. Father, thank you for your goodness to us and for your word and what it says to us, and we do pray to understand it. We are glad to have this completed revelation